Welcome back to part two out of my three-part infertility journey series. In my last episode, we left off on where my 3-year-old daughter at the time was afraid to give me a hug because she thought she would hurt me. Hi, everyone. You are listening to Beyond, and I'm your host, Dr. Flora. Listen, life is hard. You don't have to do it alone. As a mindset coach, physician, mom, and an infertility warrior, I have mastered techniques to help move you towards contentment and growth. I can't wait to go along with this crazy-ass life journey with you while making sure you feel like your best self. This podcast is meant to have you feel unstuck from your rut and less alone. Let's do this. She had called me sick mommy. I asked for a hug and she was too scared to give it to me because she was afraid to hurt me. She called me sick. But here's the catch. I wasn't sick. Yeah, I was diagnosed with infertility, but I thankfully wasn't diagnosed with a chronic illness that could physically affect me. I wasn't, again, thankfully, diagnosed with a disease that threatened my life. Mentally, yeah, I was having some hardships. I had temporary physical discomfort, maybe, yeah. But sick? I mean, as a physician, the word sick means something very, very different. So, no, that wasn't going to be my story. So, here I was, stopped in my tracks. It had been over a year now where I had started my IVF treatments. And let me tell you, I was physically bruised up. I had scar tissue built around my hips that caused me pain anytime I would go upstairs, anytime I would exercise, anytime a little person would give me a hug because their arms wrapped around the exact spots where I would inject myself. I mean, I had to change my underwear like multiple times throughout the day because I had to give myself vaginal suppository medication and that would leak and it would make me feel very uncomfortable. I had physical bruises all over my lower belly as a beautiful daily reminder of what I was going through in order to have another baby. And despite all of this physical pain, it was my heart. My heart was broken into a million pieces. Broken because I was surrounded by people growing their families, having babies left and right, multiple babies, second, third, fourth, great IVF success stories. I was broken because I was constantly being asked when I was going to have another baby. I was broken because of the pitying looks, the unsolicited advice, the unwelcomed opinions about how a normal family looked different than what I had already. So, yeah, I was heartbroken, but I was not picking up the pieces. I continued to choose to feel broken. And I was not trying to heal for everyone who was here for me, for everyone and everything that I had been blessed with. I was choosing to be in that state, lingering in that state. It was making me act like a miserable, horrible person, constantly irritated, constantly frustrated, constantly angry, constantly sad, constantly in pain, constantly envious, constantly comparing. I mean, that sounds miserable. Would you want to be around that? I was determined to change that narrative. That was not going to be my story. That was not going to be my narrative. So I knew I had to make a mindset shift, not only for the sake of my daughter, my husband, my family, friends, but most importantly, me. So first, I started shifting how I looked at this whole infertility thing. Now, look, let's get this out of the way. Infertility sucks. Having it sucks. IVF sucks. Not being able to give your child a sibling, not being able to grow your family on your own terms sucks. It's a shit situation. But despite that shit situation that was handed over to me, I couldn't let it control all of me. I needed to learn to let go of what I didn't have control over. And I needed to learn how to take control over what I could. So, what could I control? Me. How I approached my diagnosis, how I approached treatments, how I approached the outcomes, how I approached next steps. I had control over these things. So the rest, I had to let it go. I had to leave it in the past. My mantra became, I can't let yesterday's woes overcome today's joys. I couldn't let that rob my ability to make new memories and new experiences. Instead, I started approaching my diagnosis of infertility through a different viewpoint: education. This was a while ago, and even though infertility is in a much more open space, not quite completely 100%, but compared to 5 years ago, I decided I could not be a victim of my diagnosis. When someone would press on that subject matter about why we weren't growing our family, if I had the bandwidth, I would open up about my diagnosis. I would educate them about infertility, how common it is, what secondary infertility is, and how common that was. FYI, it's just as common as primary infertility. And you know what? If someone felt uncomfortable or awkward or thinking, oh, that was just TMI from that woman, I really hoped they learned their lesson. I hope they learned not to ask such personalized questions or bringing up that subject matter in a nonchalant way. It's potentially triggering, it's potentially hurtful. And asking someone about their fertility status is not small talk. I really hope they learn that. It's not a joking matter. And it takes tact and timing. And the conversation is really based upon the type of relationship you have with this person. So, coming from a traditional, stereotypical South Asian Gujarati family, you can only imagine the amount of questions, concerns, advice, opinions, and miseducation that I was constantly surrounded by. We were once at a wedding, and I had this auntie. It was the mom of someone I went to college with. I probably hadn't seen her in 10 years, but she came up to me to catch up, very sweet. Within the first few minutes, we were catching up on each other's lives, and she brought up her daughter-in-law who had 2 kids and just talking about her life as a grandma. Again, very sweet. I patiently listened, nodded my head. I congratulated her. And then the bomb countdown started. So, Flora, when are you having another baby? Oh, we're not. We're actually really good, Auntie. We're so happy Gia is thriving. Oh, that is not acceptable. She needs a sibling, Flora. Oh, y'all thought that was the bomb. Just keep going. Let's wait. We're actually really good, Auntie. She absolutely needs a sibling. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it, Flora. This auntie started walking away, and in that split second, I made the decision to stand up for myself. And I gently grabbed her wrist to stop her from walking away. And I looked her dead in the eye. And I said, when you are unable to have more children, Auntie, there are all the ifs, ands, and buts about it. And then I walked away. Now, what I didn't think about at the time is that this was an Indian wedding. So I was going to see this woman again because, of course, there were about 25.5 million events in the span of like 3 to 5 days. So the next day, at the next wedding event, of course, I saw her from afar. I avoided her. I basically had nothing more to say to her. I made my peace with it. Hopefully she realized her mistake. And I had moved on. But of course, on my way to the bathroom, she saw me. She flagged me down. She cornered me and she apologized. She said, "Beta, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for my words yesterday. I told my daughter what you said, and she brought up your Instagram page. And she explained to me what infertility was. And she told me that I should not have said that because I never know what someone else is going through. So I realized my mistake. And Beta, I'm very, very sorry." I was stunned. Here was this Indian auntie. I don't know. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, in her antiquated way of thinking, realizing her hiccup, getting an education about a diagnosis that she may or may not have really heard about or understood fully, realizing her hiccup and apologizing for it. And in that moment, I realized that using my diagnosis for education and raising awareness instead of wallowing in my victimhood could potentially make a difference. Now, I didn't have to shout it out from the rooftops. I didn't have to go onto social media. Honestly, the only reason I did go onto social media at that time was to make myself feel less isolated in this journey. So I decided to share my journey. But besides the point, I realized I could take advantage of these small moments, these small one-on-one moments, and raise awareness and educate and really make a difference by starting to open up conversations about it instead of feeling isolated and feeling like I was suffering alone with this diagnosis of infertility. During my IVF journey, I made the conscious decision to take the word failure out of my verbiage. So let me preface this conversation by explaining what it takes to prepare for a transfer. To prepare for an embryo transfer, there is a lot involved to make sure every single solitary step goes right. Meds need to be taken at a very specific time. Labs then need to be subsequently drawn at very specific times in order to ensure that your hormones were responding appropriately to the medications that you were taking. Ultrasounds need to be done to make sure your ovaries and your uterine lining were all prepared and not freaking out. You also need to make sure you weren't having side effects from all the different types of meds and blood draws and ultrasounds. So after all of that work and all of that time and all of that stress, minimum 3 to 4 weeks, imagine this. It's the day. It's the day. It's embryo transfer day. I remember walking into the patient room where they do the embryo transfers. I was given privacy to change into my gown, a beautiful bouffant hat, major fashion statement. And then the medical assistant came back in to offer me warm blankets, socks to help me feel comfortable. I was nervous. Every time, every transfer, it never got easier. There was always a lot riding on it. I mean, I've spent tens of thousands of dollars to prepare for this day. And it wasn't only about the money, it was the time, the energy, the emotional roller coaster, the physical, mental ups and downs. The room that I was in had 2 doors. So one was facing the patient hallway, which is where I had just come from. I had changed. The second was to the fertility lab, where all these little embryos were waiting and being prepared to be transferred. The lab tech from the fertility office walks in from that door and she gives me a warm smile. She verified my name, my date of birth, just to make sure I'm the right patient. She goes back into the lab and places my embryo on a surface that has a camera. And that camera is projecting the image to a TV that is in my patient room. So at that point in time, it's the lab tech, the doctor quickly walked in, and the medical assistant, and we all verify that the label to that embryo was me, and my name was the one that's on my patient wrist bracelet, and that we were ready to go. Doctor leaves for a little bit. She comes back in. She is very excited, lots of positive, good words. She holds my hand, and we all take a moment to send good vibes to this little embryo that she's going to gently place into my uterus by inserting this pipette looking device up my vagina. It was a quick procedure. I felt a small pinch. I saw the whole thing on ultrasound. And then they have you rest alone for a little bit. Then they transfer you to a wheelchair and wheel you down to the car where Sanjay was waiting, and I go home. And then the wait, the dreaded 2-week wait, where we have to give the embryo time to implant and develop and start moving towards the fetus stage. And it can go in any direction. It can implant, obviously, and develop into a full-blown human baby. It could start developing and then stop, ending in a pregnancy loss or a miscarriage. It can not implant, and then you're just simply not pregnant. I mean, literally any possible scenario in between. It was so stressful every time. And at the end of the 2 weeks, you're scheduled for a lab draw to check if you're pregnant. Now, obviously, I've had my fair share of transfers that didn't work. And what I used to call them were transfer failures. And then I realized no one failed anything here. The IVF transfer wasn't a failure. The pregnancy wasn't a failure. The doctor wasn't a failure. I wasn't a failure. This was not a test that I studied for. This was just a mean game of probability. And I know that my doctor, my medical team, and I did everything in our power each round to maximize our chances of success. Okay, so the probability didn't work in my favor. I just had to change my verbiage around. I started to call my transfers that were not going through as unsuccessful. I switched it. I started calling my miscarriages, my pregnancy failures, I started calling them pregnancy losses because that's what they were. Because I switched my verbiage around, it made it less personal, less harsh. There was less blame, less guilt. And trust me, it took me a long time to let go of the guilt and the blame and everything that surrounded each transfer. But in the end, I know I did nothing wrong. I gave it my all, and it just wasn't meant to be in that round. Changing my approach to my diagnosis allowed me to breathe. And there were so many little things like verbiage changes and not letting that diagnosis control me and finding a different purpose for that diagnosis while I go through the journey that truly helped me rewire my brain around it. And that also allowed me to take control over my relationship with Gia and with my husband. So let's first start with Sanjay. I think oftentimes we forget in our infertility journey that the partners are also going through this. Now, yes, we're both going through this roller coaster, and I was going through probably a harsher roller coaster with a lot more drops and turns and twists, but he was still on a roller coaster. And yes, I was taking the physical and emotional burden of this, but he also had an emotional burden as well. He still felt helpless when I was in pain. He still felt guilt when I was taking on the physical and emotional tolls of the losses. He felt shame that he continued to want another child and this is what it was taking. And instead of wallowing in only my sorrows, I took control over how I grieved with my husband and how he grieved with me. I shared that responsibility instead of taking it on all by myself. This wasn't a one-sided experience. So, yes, I shared it with Sanjay. Of course, I leaned on him. He was my rock and he continues to be that. But I also offered him a shoulder to lean on as well. It was a small act of service that gave me purpose other than a baby making machine, which clearly I wasn't. That whole experience and how we decided to approach it together solidified our relationship. And it also solidified and changed the trajectory that we were going to take our marriage in. And I also told myself that just because we were going through hardships doesn't mean we couldn't make good memories. It doesn't mean we couldn't make good memories with our current family of 3. And so that's what I also did is started to take control over my experience and my memories with my baby Gia. We took control over our blessings. We grounded ourselves in gratitude. And we made those memories alongside the memories of our infertility journey. Yes, there were hard times, of course. Pregnancy losses are hard. They hit you. Those transfers that don't take are hard. They hit you too. I still had pain. I still had emotional ups and downs. I still had daggers in my heart when I heard pregnancy announcements. And I gave myself time to grieve, to feel sad, to feel like crap. But I remembered not to linger. I remembered I could pull myself out of that. And I could bring positive, non-sick mommy memories and experiences to my daughter. I mean, no one deserved the sick mommy version of me all the time. So now when I look back at pictures during that time frame of a couple of years, they're full of good memories, good experiences, good travel, good outings. I mean, they're also full of needles and bruises and memories that really don't bring me happiness. But I know that that journey changed me because I took control over my mindset and how I thought about it and how I thought about my relationship. And because I changed how I thought about my relationships with Sanjay and Gia, it brought me to holding boundaries. I not only took control over my thoughts and what I could bring to my family, but I took control over how much energy I was spending. And I started to have clarity on my priorities. I mean, most importantly, these boundaries were with myself because I realized I couldn't give 100% to 100 different things. I started to list out my top priorities at that time, which were having another baby, my family's stability and happiness, and my own ability to reach contentment no matter what was going on around me. Now, I know you guys are probably thinking, like, Flora, what does that mean? That sounds so frou-frou. That's so vague. How can I apply this to real life situations? Well, let me tell you. Putting boundaries on myself meant no more double booking patients when I had to change my schedule around to accommodate my fertility schedule. No more staying way after hours, pulling long hours for patients because I had to change my schedule around because of my infertility journey. No more guilt, no more shame for canceling because I had to put my energy towards the priority at that time of having another child. I needed to prioritize my doctor's appointments, my meds, the whole transfer cycle with as little stress as possible. I mean, the extra stress, shame, and guilt, I'm sure didn't help. So why was I choosing to live in that space? I had to change the triggers that brought me to those feelings. That meant also saying no to invites if I felt drained from those top 3 priorities: birthday parties, dinners, outings, people coming over, maybe some family events. That meant also taking the time to build boundary statements, like what you had just heard about the auntie story. When I prepped boundary statements, it meant I had to use less energy trying to come up with like a bunch of comebacks, or it took less energy to say those pre-prepped boundary statements versus going through the highs and lows of ignorant people saying ignorant things to me. So when someone said, "Keep going, Gia needs a sibling, you got this," or "Don't be sad, at least you have a child," or "I think you need to keep trying. Only children grow up to be spoiled and a little weird." Stupid ass comments. Yes, I know. But whenever people did say stuff like that, because I had prepped myself, because I had a list of statements that I would say to protect my peace, I would just pull from that box, say it, and walk away. If I had the bandwidth, maybe start a more in-depth conversation. It also meant distancing myself from negative people. Now, I'm not talking about like the overtly mean, bitchy people. I mean, you know who these people are. I mean, the people where after you spend time with them, you walk away and you think to yourself, God, I'm drained. I feel kind of irritated and annoyed too by that person's words and behaviors. I need to vent to somebody because what they did and said just didn't sit right. I distanced myself from those people. I started to protect my peace. And when I started to do that, I started to gain clarity in what actually mattered to me, what actually brought happiness to me. And when I stopped constantly playing victim, and when I stopped constantly living and answering with anger and defensiveness, I started to see that those check boxes that I depended upon for my happiness and for my worth never truly made me happy. Instead of setting myself up for contentment, I was setting myself up to be like a checklist woman. That doesn't sound fun. Obviously, that's not what really matters. So I stopped wasting time on that checklist. I changed the checklist eventually. I started to be in the present. How can I make my situation better now, given what was handed over to me? I started noticing the little joys in life that wouldn't mark off a simple checkbox. I started feeling content. I chose to stop being labeled as sick. I chose to bring value to everyone I met, especially my husband and my daughter. And with that mindset, we were eventually brought to the decision that our family of 3 was kind of perfect. And we needed to stop wasting our time with trying to grow our family. That part is coming in part 3. Stay tuned for next time. Thank you so much for listening, you all. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for joining and spending your precious time here with me. As someone who prioritizes her energy, I am so grateful that you chose to spend yours here. To help me help you, please take an extra 30 seconds of your time to rate and review the podcast on your listening platform. For more tips and a behind-the-scenes look into my life, follow me on Instagram at Dr. Flora Sinha. That's Dr. Flora Sinha. Finally, connecting with you truly fills my cup. So DM me on Instagram, email me at florasinhamd@gmail.com, repost if you love this episode. I love hearing from you. I am so grateful for you and cannot wait to be back for the next episode. Bye.